In the shadows of a luxury mansion, where secrets are more valuable than gold, a young maid discovers she is pregnant by the most powerful man in town. He has it all: money, influence, and a perfect family. But how far would he go to keep his life immaculate? Today, we're going to unravel a story of love, power, and betrayal that pushes the boundaries of what we're willing to sacrifice for the sake of perfection. Before we dive into this exciting plot, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and give the video a like. It goes a long way in bringing more stories as it is to you. Now get ready, because what happens within the walls of this mansion will shock even the most hardened hearts. Let's go. Ricardo Vasconcelos was a man of means, a respected businessman and influential throughout the country. His decisions shaped the market. His actions were admired, and his family inhabited a stately mansion that made anyone feel insignificant when they set foot there. Everything seemed to be perfect in Ricardo's universe. A beautiful and devoted wife, Carolina, and a 15-year-old son, Paulo, who had always been a source of pride for the family. However, behind all the luxury and apparent harmony, there were dark secrets that he did everything to keep buried. Beatriz Moura, a young woman from humble origins, had grown up understanding that life would not be easy. From a very young age, she had taken on the responsibility of helping her family by working as a maid. Little by little, he went through different houses, performing exhausting tasks and receiving modest salaries. But everything changed when she got a place precisely in the Vasconcelos mansion. The place was sumptuous. Impeccable gardens, crystal chandeliers hanging from the ceiling, and priceless furniture. The work was heavy, but it offered a payment that could help Beatrice support her own house and dream of a minimally stable future. At first, Ricardo didn't even notice Beatrice. For him, she was just another new maid who had to do the job without attracting attention. But, little by little, the routines of that mansion crossed their paths. One afternoon, Beatrice was finishing cleaning one of the large offices when Ricardo entered with a tense face. He seemed worried, and instead of ignoring her, he asked her to make her a coffee. The request, at first, seemed normal, but that day, it only took a few minutes of conversation for the dynamic between the two to change forever. Ricardo began to talk about the weight of maintaining the image of the perfect man. He confided to Beatrice that he felt immense loneliness, despite living surrounded by people and assistants. He talked about the pressures to always be at the top, the constant demands for great results, and how sometimes all that greatness suffocated him. Although Beatrice did not have the same baggage, she understood the anguish of the boss. He also carried his own pressures: the fear of losing his job, the need to help his distant family, the desire to build some dignified future for himself. That quick conversation was the spark. In the following days, each time Ricardo appeared at the mansion outside of his trips, he found a way to exchange a few more words with Beatrice. At first, everything was very discreet, as he did not want to arouse suspicion at home. She, in turn, despite hesitating, felt attracted by the attention of someone so far from her reality. And as the weeks passed, they became confidants. Beatrice felt a strong inner contradiction. She knew that Ricardo was a married man with a public image and a family life. But his magnetism, added to the gentle and seductive way he treated her, completely enveloped her. The conversations deepened until, one late afternoon, the inevitable happened. Looks and gestures of affection turned into kisses, then in an intense but secret relationship. No one inside that mansion could ever suspect what was going on, and they both knew it. For Ricardo, being with Beatrice was a kind of escape valve, a place where he felt understood without having to maintain the facade of an impeccable man. For Beatrice, being with him was a confusing experience, but also overwhelming. I had never met someone who seemed so secure, so powerful, while showing a trace of fragility and tiredness. This relationship continued for months, kept under lock and key. Every day, Beatrice found herself more trapped in a complicated love, nurturing the foolish hope that one day Ricardo would separate to definitively assume a life by her side. But at the same time, she was fully aware that for him, it was probably just a case. He made it clear that he would never put his reputation at risk. Beatrice repressed herself, trying not to question too much, trying to enjoy the moments they had. Until reality exploded before her eyes. A pharmacy test confirmed what she had already suspected for days. She was pregnant. Beatrice spent sleepless nights, not knowing what to do. The pregnancy seemed to her a miracle and, at the same time, a gigantic problem. And his biggest internal dilemma was to tell Ricardo or not. Deep down, she imagined that she needed to be honest, especially if she wanted her son to have some support from his father. But the fear of his reaction, of how it would affect her life, and of possible retaliation, consumed her completely. After days of torment, she found the courage to talk to Ricardo in his office. I needed him to know the situation. The tension in Ricardo's eyes when he heard her made Beatrice even more afraid. He was silent for long seconds before finally saying words as cold as blades. There was no empathy. There was no emotion. He limited himself to babbling that it could not happen, that it would be a disaster for the family, for the business, for the name Vasconcelos. That child in his eyes was an incalculable risk, and not a child to be loved. And, in an unbearable coldness, he offered Beatrice money so that she would leave the city, disappear, and never look for him again. Beatrice's refusal was immediate, even though her voice was filled with tremors. She was no opportunist wanting to extract money. His wish, at the very least, was that Ricardo would recognize the child, that he would be a father, if not for her, at least for the baby. But when he realized that Beatrice would not accept simply disappearing, Ricardo got angry. He ordered her to gather her belongings and leave the mansion that same day. As if that were not enough, he left her with a threat. If she told anyone what had happened, he would use all his influence to make her regret it for the rest of her life. Beatrice left the place with her soul destroyed. The man in whom he had trusted and for whom he had had a sincere feeling now showed him a face that seemed to belong to a complete stranger, cruel and selfish. With no alternatives, she was forced to remain silent because Ricardo had in fact the means to end her life. However, she could not deny the reality that was growing in her womb. She was then alone, without a job, and expecting a child that her father had already declared he did not want. Beatrice's life was transformed. He rented a humble little room on the outskirts, which was far from the luxury he had become accustomed to while working at the Vasconcelos mansion. With no other option, he started looking for informal jobs and got some cleaning services in smaller offices. The salary was negligible, but she needed to support herself and prepare for the arrival of her son. Gradually, she saw her support network formed by supportive neighbors, also struggling women who understood the anguish of a single mother. Time passed, and Gabriel was born on a bright sunny day, as if he wanted to bring light to the darkness that hovered over Beatrice's life. As she looked at that fragile baby, she experienced a mixture of unconditional love and sadness. The feeling for Ricardo still hurt, but the biggest pain was knowing that Gabriel would never know his own father. And that consumed her inside, but at the same time gave her the courage to keep fighting. For the first time, she felt that she had a purpose greater than any other, to protect her son. Raising Gabriel was not a simple task. Beatrice spent nights awake taking care of him, doing odd jobs here and there to get the basics to live. Sometimes she had to take him to work so as not to leave him alone, or she had the generous help of an elderly neighbor who had grown fond of the child. Even so, the bond between mother and son became stronger and stronger, fed by the determination of those who, despite so many difficulties, would never leave the boy helpless. Time flew by, and when Gabriel reached the age of 10, he began to question Beatrice about her father. He saw his friends talking about Daddy and did not understand why his never appeared or even called. Beatrice tried very carefully to avoid the truth. She said that Gabriel's father was far away, involved in problems that prevented him from being there. However, internally, she suffered. How to tell Ricardo's cruelty without breaking his son's heart? How to explain that his father, despite knowing of his existence, had chosen to ignore him? Over the years, Gabriel's questions became more incisive. As a teenager, he felt that something didn't fit. Beatrice noticed her son's anguish, but feared bringing him into a world of pain. He even sent some letters to Ricardo, which he never answered. At certain critical moments, when Gabriel fell ill and needed expensive medicine, Beatrice called Ricardo's office, but the secretaries always found a way to ignore her or hang up the phone. As a result, she realized that there was no point in insisting. She was alone. One day, rummaging through a box of memories stored in the back of a closet, Gabriel found an old photo. He immediately recognized the figure of Beatrice, much younger, smiling next to an elegant man in an impeccable suit. That image awakened in him a strange sense of familiarity. Curiosity screamed, who was that man next to his mother? Why did Beatrice keep him among the family photos but never spoke of him? Gabriel took the photo to his mother and asked for explanations, demanding answers. Beatrice felt the shock vibrate throughout her body as if she was short of air. The face of that man, with whom she once believed she lived a great love, was there, stamped mercilessly. With nowhere to run, she told Gabriel the whole truth, that this man was called Ricardo Vasconcelos, who was a very influential businessman who had kicked her out of his house as soon as he found out about the pregnancy and had never taken on his own child. She also revealed the threats and the indescribable coldness with which she had been treated. Gabriel listened to everything in a stoic way, but inside, the whirlwind of feelings devastated him. Anger, pain, disappointment. How could one reject one's own blood in this way? From that moment on, Gabriel's life was transformed. He could not accept that his father had acted in such a cruel and indifferent way. The anger he felt, however, was accompanied by immense sadness. Every day, I became more and more angry, and Beatrice suffered when she saw him like this, fearing that this revolt would consume him. She tried to calm him down, saying that sometimes it was better to leave the past behind. But Gabriel did not accept it. It was as if he saw it all as a profound injustice that could not go unpunished. After a remarkable argument, Gabriel faced his mother firmly and declared that he would take the case to court. He wanted Ricardo to be forced to answer, to publicly admit what he had done, to bear the consequences of his actions. Beatrice felt afraid because she knew Ricardo's power. He had connections, lawyers, money to manipulate any situation. But in front of her son's determined look, she understood that there was no longer any way to hide or escape from the problem. It was time to confront once and for all the man who had ruined his life in the past and who had condemned Gabriel to grow up fatherless. With difficulty, both sought a lawyer known for defending difficult causes, Aline Farias. Aline had a reputation for not being intimidated, even if the opponent was someone as powerful as Ricardo Vasconcelos. Upon hearing Beatrice and Gabriel's story, she made several notes and was very attentive to every detail. His countenance in the end showed seriousness. She warned that it would not be a simple walk, as Ricardo would use everything in his power to demoralize mother and son. In paternity actions with influential people, lies and manipulations used to come to light, and that would require emotional strength from everyone. Still, Gabriel was firm in his decision. He didn't want money above all. He wanted justice. He wanted his father to recognize what he had done. He wanted the world to know that he existed and that he had been rejected without any compassion. Aline explained that they would sue Ricardo for recognition of paternity, also demanding compensation for moral damages and alimony, including retroactive, as he had never contributed financially to Gabriel's upbringing. In addition, there would be the labor issue involving the unfair dismissal of Beatriz, who had been expelled from the mansion without rights, under threats. Beatriz at that moment felt divided. On the one hand, he wanted the truth to come out for Ricardo to pay for the damage caused. On the other, the fear of revenge hovered like a ghost, since she knew well his ability to destroy reputations and lives. However, when he saw the determination on his son's face, something lit up inside him. It was time to face the past, as painful as that was. When the process began, Aline warned that they needed to be prepared for a war. Ricardo, as soon as he received the notification, did not take long to take his own measures. He assembled a team of renowned lawyers, led by a ruthless veteran, Dr. Moreira. The defense strategy was clear: deny everything, paint Beatriz as an opportunist who only wanted to extract money. To reinforce this idea, they would try to show that during all those years, she had never officially manifested herself, suggesting that she had only appeared now out of interest. The day the two parties met in court was fraught with tension. On one side, Beatriz and Gabriel, accompanied by Aline. On the other, Ricardo, with his haughty posture and an entourage of lawyers in impeccable suits. He didn't even look at Beatriz or Gabriel. To Ricardo, it was all an annoyance, a stain that needed to be removed from his name. Beatriz could barely face him, feeling at the same time repulsion and an old pain stirring in her chest. Gabriel, on the other hand, struggled to keep his composure, but inside, he exploded in indignation at finally facing the man who had hurt him so much. Aline presented the case firmly, reporting how Beatriz had worked at the mansion, the relationship she had had with Ricardo, the pregnancy, and the expulsion. He spoke of the fear Beatriz had felt for years and Gabriel's recent determination to seek justice. He pointed out that none of this was a scam and that the court itself could require a DNA test to confirm paternity. When it was Dr. Moreira's turn, he followed the expected script. He accused Beatriz of wanting easy money, insinuated that she had a past of troubled relationships and that she could have gotten pregnant by anyone, using the name Vasconcelos to take advantage. The lawyer's cold and calculating rhetoric sought to undermine Beatriz's credibility at all costs. Ricardo himself, when questioned, declared that it was all a fantasy created by a dissatisfied former employee. However, Aline made it clear that there was only one way to end the discussion: take the DNA test. The judge, aware of his obligation, immediately authorized the procedure. Ricardo, even though he kept his expression impassive, felt his stomach turn. He knew the truth, but he was not willing to lose it. He had friends, contacts, money, and he determined without hesitation that he would use any means to manipulate the result. Unbeknownst to Beatriz and Gabriel, the laboratory designated by the court received an unofficial visit from Ricardo himself. He bribed the doctor in charge, Dr. Adriano Silveira, to ensure that the result was inconclusive, or preferably that he pointed out that Ricardo was not Gabriel's father. The amount involved was high enough to silence any scruples, and Dr. Silveira agreed to participate in the fraud. He was a professional who, in the past, had already been cited in rumors of manipulations and questionable reports in favor of wealthy clients, but nothing had ever been proven. A few weeks later, the report was delivered to the court and, to everyone's astonishment, showed that there was no genetic compatibility between Ricardo and Gabriel. The courtroom was plunged into murmurs. Aline was perplexed. Beatriz began to tremble, and Gabriel felt his heart break. How could that outcome be negative if his own mother had told him the story, and he trusted her completely? Ricardo, on the other hand, displayed a veiled smile of satisfaction. Her lawyer, Dr. Moreira stood up with a victorious stance, accusing Beatrice of spreading lies for financial interest. He said that the farce was exposed and that the examination confirmed his client's innocence. The judge, faced with the result, could not do anything other than accept that at that moment there was not enough evidence to proceed with the accusation against Ricardo. The humiliation was devastating for Beatrice and Gabriel. The press, which followed the case, fell on it. Headlines emerged, painting Beatrice as a disingenuous woman who would have tried to extort a renowned businessman. Their public image was in tatters, and all of this hurt more than they could express. Despite the blow she had suffered, Aline did not give up. An experienced lawyer, she noticed Ricardo's attitude in court, an overconfidence that did not fit with the seriousness of the accusations. She then began to investigate, suspicious that something was out of place. He immersed himself in research on paternity tests and laboratories, reviewed documents, talked to former employees of the place where the test was carried out, and looked for any details that could be used as evidence of fraud. The first indication came when Aline discovered that Dr. Silveira, responsible for the exam, had already been cited years earlier in a filed investigation under suspicion of manipulating results for high-income clients. Nothing had been proven at the time, but that was enough to raise the alarm. The lawyer then decided to look for the doctor's former colleagues, laboratory technicians, and even retired nurses, trying to reconstruct Silveira's steps in past cases. It was difficult, but she found an assistant who had worked on the day Gabriel and Ricardo's samples were taken. The professional reported that on that date, Silveira was nervous, more attentive to his cell phone than to the procedure. Strangely, he shut himself in the lab alone for a few minutes, asking that no one interrupt him. This account in itself was not proof of crime, but it raised consistent suspicions. The big turning point occurred when Aline tracked suspicious financial transactions close to the date of the exam. She used her connections to comb through the records of shell companies and discovered large deposits linked to a corporation that actually belonged to Ricardo Vasconcelos. And one of these values in particular was directed to the name of Dr. Adriano Silveira. It had been done just 2 days before the report was made official. This was the thread that Aline needed to pull the whole ball. Armed with evidence, testimony, and documentary evidence, she took the matter to court, demanding a new DNA test, now carried out by an independent team and with security protocols in place to prevent any tampering. It also requested the opening of a formal investigation into the laboratory and the doctor responsible. The judge, in view of the seriousness of the complaints, authorized the repetition of the examination, as long as there was strict supervision by judicial experts. Ricardo, even though he tried to keep his pose, began to feel the siege closing. For years, he had won by economic power and unattainable reputation, but now the circumstances were different. The possibility of a criminal complaint for bribery and procedural fraud came to light, which could ruin not only his image, but put him in serious legal trouble. Still, he continued to deny everything, hoping that he could once again come out on top. The second test was scheduled, and this time, caution was maximum. The entire process, from collection to analysis, was monitored by officially designated professionals, without any direct contact between Ricardo and the samples or the laboratory. Beatrice and Gabriel, although they had hope, were also apprehensive. They had already gone through the trauma of the first exam, and if another fraudulent result happened, perhaps it would be the final straw on any chance of justice. When the final report arrived at the court, confirming that Gabriel was Ricardo's biological son, it was as if the air in the room became electric. Aline was ready to expose the farce of the first test. Before the judge, he proved that Ricardo had bribed Dr. Silveira, presenting bank statements, testimonies, and contradictions in the laboratory documents. The revelation fell like a bomb, generating buzz and flashes from press cameras covering the case. There was no longer any doubt that Ricardo had acted consciously to deny paternity and humiliate Beatrice and Gabriel. The judge, outraged by the attempt to defraud the justice system, harshly censured Ricardo, making it clear that there would be consequences. At the same time, they still needed to hear Gabriel, who during most of the sessions had remained silent under Aline's guidance. But the time had come for him to express everything he had been feeling. Gabriel stood up, walked to the front of the room, and spoke in a firm voice, even though his heart was about to jump out of his mouth. He recounted what it was like to grow up without a father, watching his mother sacrifice everything so that he would have as little as possible. He spoke of the pain of discovering that his father knew of his existence but had chosen to ignore him, and above all, he expressed his disappointment, saying that he was not there for money, but to demand that Ricardo recognize his own responsibilities. The emotion in Gabriel's testimony left the court in sepulchral silence. Even people close to Ricardo showed discomfort. It was impossible to remain indifferent to the drama of that young man who for so many years had lived in the shadows of a lie. The judge closed the session after hearing all sides, and a few days later handed down the sentence. Ricardo would be criminally prosecuted for attempted fraud, bribery of public officials, and manipulation of evidence. In addition, Gabriel would be officially recognized as his son, with the right to a pension and retroactive compensation. The verdict caused a stir in the press, which had previously painted Beatrice and Gabriel as fakers. Now they had to deal with the truth exposed, a truth that showed how inhuman and unscrupulous Richard had been. On the way out of court, Gabriel just wanted to be alone. So much emotion left him exhausted. He walked away to a bench outside, feeling a lump in his throat, not sure if he was happy to win or sad for the wreckage that victory would leave behind. Aline went after him and said how proud she was of his courage, remembering that, in cases like this, there was no victory without scars. Still perplexed, Gabriel nodded, acknowledging that he did not wish for anyone's ruin, but for the truth. Inside the room, meanwhile, Ricardo's wife Carolina was devastated. It had become clear that he had betrayed her, impregnating the maid, and then had tried to hide the fact at all costs. Carolina looked at Ricardo with an expression of disgust and disappointment. He declared that he would not be by his side after all. He asked for a divorce right there, in front of everyone. Their son, Paul, about the same age as Gabriel, couldn't process the fact that the father he had always been proud of was capable of so many lies. I looked at him with a mixture of pain and anger, not knowing how to react. Ricardo, suffering the most humiliating defeat of his life, saw his entire empire collapse little by little. The mansion suddenly seemed cold and empty, now that Carolina and Paolo left, taking with them that feeling of family that, although supported by appearances, made him feel minimally human. He tried to take refuge in drinks to cancel the weight on his conscience, but this only increased the guilt. The images of Gabriel, with his face marked by suffering, and of Beatrice, whom he had once deceived with unspoken promises, hovered in his mind with every sip. 2 nights after the verdict, Ricardo sank into a bar, drinking until he lost part of his consciousness. The rain was falling outside, as if the sky was mourning the destruction he himself had caused. He decided to drive back home, even though he was completely intoxicated. On the way, he remembered Carolina's phrases, Paolo's tears, Beatrice's broken look, and Gabriel's fierce resentment. The storm made the streets slippery, and Ricardo's vision was blurred. But he insisted on stepping on the accelerator, as if trying to run away from himself. A brief nap at the wheel was enough to turn him into a victim of his own recklessness. The car crashed violently into the back of a truck. The sound of the collision was deafening, and the impact so brutal that Ricardo died right there, stuck to the hardware, before any help could save him. The news of his death spread quickly. The decadence of a tycoon, tragically ended in a rain-soaked street. The burial took place in a heavy atmosphere. Few family members and acquaintances attended. Carolina, although devastated by the pain of seeing her ex-husband leave so abruptly, still carried the hurt he had planted in her soul. Paulo, visibly shaken, could barely maintain his posture. Beatrice and Gabriel were, in a way, out of respect for what once existed, even though the memory of Ricardo was now so bitter. At the end of the ceremony, Carolina took Gabriel aside, handing him an envelope. He said that Ricardo had left instructions for her to be delivered to the son he never recognized in life. Gabriel opened the envelope with trembling hands. He found a note, written in hurried handwriting. "Forgive me for everything I have done to you. Be the man I didn't know how to be." Next to the note, there was the will. Contrary to expectations, Ricardo had allocated half of all his assets to Gabriel. The other half belonged to Carolina and Paulo. No one could tell if it was a final act of redemption or just an attempt to clear their conscience. In any case, that gesture deeply moved Gabriel. He looked at Beatrice, who was next to him, her eyes teary. His mother hugged him tightly, conveying a silent message that all would be well, that they would survive this tide of absurd events. Gabriel didn't know if he felt pity, hatred, or relief. He had, in his hands, the legacy of a man who had ruined so many lives. Was there a way to turn that into something good? The years passed. A decade later, Gabriel had become a 25-year-old adult, while Paulo, at 26, took over part of the companies that once belonged to his father. Surprisingly, the two half-brothers found a way of partnership in rebuilding the Vasconcelos family business. Paulo, who had a degree in administration and finance, was methodical and strategist, while Gabriel, who had studied technology, had innovative ideas to modernize the company, making it more transparent and sustainable. They transformed the empire inherited from Richard into something very different from what it had been in the past. With a focus on social responsibility and honesty, the business prospered without the dirty maneuvers that once marked the Vasconcelos name. Together, they implemented programs to support low-income youth, invested in clean technology, and cultivated ethical values for each sector of the organization. It was as if, in a way, they wanted to repair the negative marks left by their father's attitudes. Beatrice, in turn, continued her life alongside her son. After so much suffering, she found love again in a man named Alfredo, owner of a small bicycle repair shop. He was simple, but endowed with a genuine generosity, which reminded her that happiness could manifest itself in small gestures. They got married and enjoyed a quiet life, without great luxuries, but full of affection and companionship. Carolina, on the other hand, remade her life with another businessman, Fernando, but this time she chose someone who valued honesty and family values. Paulo had accepted his stepfather well, concentrating on keeping in touch with his mother and guiding the inherited business, now by Gabriel's side. Although Carolina and Beatrice had not become close friends, they learned to respect each other, especially because of the bond of brotherhood that had united Gabriel and Paulo. Thus the past of lies and suffering had not been erased, but had become a learning experience. Gabriel and Paul understood that power should not be used to subjugate or attack the other, but to build something meaningful that would benefit society as a whole. With each social project they implemented, with each young person who received a scholarship, they remembered how it had all begun. The mistake of a father who had rejected his son, but who, in a last flash of lucidity, had left resources for the legacy to be transformed into something bigger and better. Beatrice, always discreet, saw in her son's success a reason for undeniable pride. Knowing that Gabriel had become a man of integrity, despite everything he had experienced in his childhood, was the greatest reward of his life. In her eyes, the certainty shone that love could overcome even the worst circumstances. Gabriel, on the other hand, still carried inner scars. He occasionally remembered the figure of Ricardo, reflecting on how one could have everything and, at the same time, choose ruin. These thoughts appeared like ghosts, but no longer consumed him. He had learned to deal with the past, incorporating it into the will to make a difference in the present. Over the course of a decade, the brothers built a solid reputation for the corporation, now renamed with a new title that made clear the change in stance. They have become references of innovation, sustainability, and social responsibility. No one remembered the scandals that once haunted the name Vasconcelos. And for Gabriel, this business redemption was almost a response to his father's last request. Written in that note, "Be the man I didn't know how to be." Life went on with joy, achievements, and above all, the feeling of overcoming a past full of pain and lies. Beatriz and Gabriel's story was no longer about abandonment, but about resilience. Ricardo's mistake, although unforgivable, had generated reflections and transformations that would echo forever. The boy who had been rejected became a respectable man. The woman who had been humiliated found peace and love. The empire that had been built on fragile foundations of appearances became an example of clean and empathetic administration. And so, despite the storms that shook so many lives, there was now new hope for all who were in any way touched by these events. In this way, each character faced their own inner demons, revealing courages and weaknesses, confronting past mistakes, and forging a different future. What one day began with the betrayal of a rich and powerful man resulted, in the end, in learning, in unusual family connections, and in the irrefutable proof that no matter how strong evil is, there is always room for truth to rise, for justice to prevail, and for love, that feeling that imposes overcoming, to be reborn in wounded hearts.